Okay, so hello everyone. My name is Giuseppe Martinico, and I am one of the directors of the Sant'Anna Legal Studies program, together with Giacomo Delle Donne and Filippo Fontanelli. And today, I'm very happy to share this seminar, which is a kind of hybrid seminar. We have some people in the audience online. We have some members of the faculty here at the Scuola Superiore Sant'Anna. And we have the pleasure to have as a speaker today the Professor Armen Mashmanian, who is a professor of law at the American University of Armenia and currently a visiting professor at the Policy Institute of the Scuola Superiore Sant'Anna. He has been he has written extensively on covering, I mean, both comparative constitutional law and also the European law. For instance, I want to mention an important edited volume, the edited with Patricia Fobelier, and he has been writing a lot on constitutional courts in particular. And today he's gonna give a speech, which is in between, I would say, right? In between the comparative, the constitutional law and political theory. So, or also we would say philosophy of law possibility. So I'm eager, I mean, to listening to Armen. I'll join the audience in a second, but I want to thank Armen for accepting our invitation. And having said that, thanks again, and I give you the floor. Armen, thank you. I'll join you.
Thank you very much indeed, and let me take the chance and thank you. And thanks to the Dear Policy Institute for having me as a visitor in this spring here. And thank you to the Legal Studies style seminars for hosting the seminar, but also Giuseppe and Giacomo, thank you very much for actually hosting me physically here, but also having me to present in this very popular and interesting seminar series. When I was thinking of the title of the presentation, when I ended up with the current one, I thought that the title should reflect the subject quite illustratively. When I'm looking at it now, I still think that order or freedom is probably a tension or an inquiry that is in the heart of what has been discussed already for so many years in the context of the democratic backsliding or the rise of illiberalism, as you wish. The tension between liberal democracy on one hand, and I want to deliberately avoid the term illiberal democracy because I find it to be a very reductionist or even nonsensical term, and yet liberal democracy on one hand and all its discontents or oppositions to that concept from especially the parts of the countries which claim to be democracies. So that tension, order versus freedom, I think it lies in the heart of also that discussion. While the second leg of the title is probably will sound more unlikely, because I haven't seen very much debate about legalism featuring very prominently as part of that debate about democratic backsliding. And in this context, I want to pose the question that was driving me in doing this research from the very outset. And the question I want to ask doing this research and also presenting this research is why some societies prove more susceptible to illiberalism than the others. That's the bigger question actually, which is answered, especially by sociologists and political scientists, with respect to the consolidation of the state of consolidation of democratic institutions or political cultures, etc. But the element of it, which is probably, I think, is not answered to a very exhaustive extent within this discussion is why some legal cultures prove to be more susceptible to illiberalism than the others. Or if you wish, why some judiciaries prove to be more susceptible or weak facing illiberal tendencies in political world. This inquiry may sound implausible because it is not very popular. But saying this, I should acknowledge that this hasn't been the case, for example, after the Second World War, where there has been a lot of research and a lot of discussion actually about exactly the legal culture and the legal patterns, legal mindset playing a role in resisting then the authoritarian, totalitarian tendencies in the European continent. And the debate has been quite vibrant also about why did lawyers and especially judges resist or not resist and in Italy, and why the lawyers and judges did or did not resist in Germany, respectively, the fascist and Nazi consolidation at some point. This debate sounds very interesting to me. I'm right now trying to access and make sense of the Italian language literature on the subject. You, my Italian colleagues, obviously know more about it than me, but then I had a chance to actually familiarize myself with the English language literature on this. And if I can recall one or two of this, particularly the work by a prominent Italian-born but American Jurist, Guido Calabresi, who was also a higher-ranked judge in the United States, but also a very famous scholar and the dean of the Yale Law School, where he speaks about the Italian legal system, introducing it, if you wish, in a nutshell to the American audience. And then he had a few points which are very striking to me. And I could probably speak about two of them here in the context of my presentation. One argument that he makes in his work about the Italian legal mindset then in the 20th century, we're speaking about his writings which were in the second half of the 20th century, is about the presumed formalism of the Italian judiciary. And he speaks about he confirms actually the stereotypical vision among others of the American legal community about the Italian legal system, that the Italian legal system or the legal mindset is rather formalistic. And by confirming that, this is one proposition he's making, which sounds very paradoxical to me, honestly, is that actually that formalism saved to some extent Italian democracy or whatever democratic patterns could be remaining during the fascist regime. And he thinks that exactly the formalistic patterns which Italy had developed before the fascist takeover were helping the judges to resist the total takeover of the legal sphere by the fascist ideology. As I will tell you later, this proposition sounds implausible to me, but then I would move to the second proposition that is making, and it is also quite striking to me, but interesting rather than paradoxical. And this proposition is that actually the Italian legal culture has not been like this for a long time, and that his proposition is that this formalism of the Italian legal mindset is something that was imported from Germany, actually, and carried the German influence. While before that, starting from the Middle Ages and towards the end of the 19th century, Calabresi would argue that the Italian legal system actually would be very functionalist, as the Americans would put it, or at least anti-formalist. And he recalls the very strong traditions of progressive legal thinking in Italy in the Middle Ages, and would bring the example of the University of Bologna, which would be the center of the progressive legal thinking among other disciplines. an interesting case that he cites actually about the legal mindset in Italy in the Middle Ages is still originating from Bologna, and he says, probably you know this case, maybe it's famous. He says that when Bologna had a law which said that spilling blood on the street is illegal, and the law would definitely refer to dueling, actually prohibiting dueling on the streets. And then one man would walk on the street and feel bad, and then a doctor comes, and it was the convention in the Middle Ages, the doctor would, the first thing to do would spill the blood in order to, the bad blood would go. So the policeman comes and says, spilling the blood on the streets of Bologna is illegal, so I'm arresting you. So when the doctor is taken to the judge, and the judge looks at the law and the offense, the judge says, no, indeed, the law, the spirit of the law is not to mean any spilling of the blood, but only dueling. And by this case, Calabrese actually convinced the reader that the Italian legal system was very much functionalist and very much oriented on the spirit. And then it is really the German legal tradition and its influence that turned the Italian mindset to be more formalistic in its essence. What I find implausible about Calabrese's first argument, and then it is not only him, but I was also reading Kes Sunstein, for example, who also argued that the fascist judges, the judges under the fascist regime, who were also sympathetic with the, the Nazi regime, who were sympathetic with the Nazi regime, would also depart from the literal meaning of the law, kind of exploiting non-formalism or functionalism and reaching the degrees of judicial activism. And the point was that actually the fact that the judges were departing from formalism was destructive and was helpful to the Nazi regime to capture the legal profession and especially the judiciary. Why I find these two propositions implausible, because actually they run quite contrary to what Judith Schlar, who is a famous political theorist, actually a Harvard professor back at the end of the last century, but is also probably the most important authority on legalism by far. Judith Schlar would also point to the German legal professionals, and especially the judges' very easy adaptability to the Nazi ideology. And she would explain this by this, the German legal profession's inherent conservatism and conservative adaptability to whatever comes from the perceived sovereign. And the similar point comes from Giovanni Sartori, who also points especially to Italian and German examples with fascism and Nazism, saying that the fact that the judiciary was so susceptible and was so easily taken by the two authoritarian ideologies was also explained to some extent by the fact that they were inherently formalists and neglecting the very spirit of the law that they were applying. Obviously, the discussion then is centered around formalism or functionalism on the other hand, and it's quite central also to legal theory in general. But while legalism is more than only formalism, it's also about proceduralism, it's also about over-legislation, it's also about quite grotesque bureaucracy that is characterizing legalism. For one, we can use the adjective Kafkaesque bureaucracy in some countries that we can witness until now. By the way, Kafka himself being a lawyer working in an insurance company in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, some scholars of Kafka would explain actually his work describing this labyrinth of bureaucracy exactly by him being lost in the world of very complicated bureaucracy in the legal profession. So Kafka's bureaucracy, one other feature that distinguishes legalism, but yet This being said, the formalism is probably the most important feature that distinguishes the legal aspects of legalism, and which also is the center of the debate around the phenomenon. For Judith Schlar, as I told you, she is probably by far the most important authority on legalism. The definition of legalism as it stands is centered around a few propositions, and let me reiterate some of the most important of these. At first, it's for her, it's a code of conduct based on rules and commands which need to be followed regardless of the moral background of these rules or commands. And I cannot avoid but to pay attention to the term commands. While rules is quite easy, it's the rules, the laws, the statutes that come from the sovereign. The commands, the word commands really illustrates the degree of legalism and the degree of attachment to whatever comes from the upper decision makers. And I cannot really resist at this moment of time to think of not only the soldiers, the Russian soldiers who got the command to commit war crimes. Because in the military, I mean, following the command is more or less accepted universally, without any reservations. But we would rather think of the judges or other legal professionals or other decision makers who get the command, for example, to imprison or to deport all the dissenters about what's happening in Russia regarding Ukraine. But so many public intellectuals, celebrities, and other people who have voiced their disagreement with the policy about Ukraine, and they are really, many of them are imprisoned, and this is done by the judges. Many of them are deported, and this is done by bureaucrats, etc. They take the command coming from the sovereign, and we know who can be the sovereign in this sense in Russia, and the command should be taken without reservations, regardless of its moral origin. So this is an interesting term that distinguishes the degree of legalism in some societies that we can speak about. For Judith Schlar, legalism is also an ethical attitude. Beyond being a code of conduct, it's also an ethical attitude that holds moral conduct to be a matter of rule following. So you follow any rule that is existing, and it is itself following the rule is actually what constitutes the moral obligation. What is very, very important, and I think my title also reflects this tendency, is that in many ways, legalism has grown, especially in our micro-regulated world, where there are so many rules, in fact. It has grown into a genuine social ethos, genuine social pattern, which is distinguished by an instinct of identifying the law without a reference to its socio-political context. Many would refer to the legal professionals especially, and I cannot resist but think of Kelsen-Spoor's theory of law. What is Kelsen-Spoor's theory of law except that an attempt to detach law from its political context, and a theory, a positivist ideology that has really heavily affected the emergence of a legal mindset in the continental part of Europe. Now, the relationship of legalism versus democracy has been also quite heavily researched and described since at least Tocqueville, who thought that the relationship really represents the tension between order and freedom, as I first reflected at the beginning of my talk. Order versus freedom is what de Tocqueville thought that legalism is representing. if you follow the orders without any reference to the moral standing of these orders, or the rules, then you are the guardian of the order, Tocqueville would say. So rephrasing this, we could say that the judiciaries which are legalistic, the judiciaries which are exercising, implementing law, the politicized law, they are the guardians of the order. But then the second question is, what kind of order are they guardians of? And for Giovanni Sartori, it's quite clear-cut in his very insightful paper on constitutionalism and the origins and the meaning, the clear meaning, as he would say, of constitutionalism. The politicized exercise of law is resulting in the protection of the political order, very much like the point of Tocqueville is, and he is saying, is continuing that the protection of the legal order, even if nominally based on a legal document called constitution, cannot be associated with constitutionalism in its real nuclear meaning. Because what he would suggest, and I'm really impressed with that suggestion, constitutionalism is not necessarily associated with having a document called constitution, not even having a series of documents called constitutional document, but essentially it's about what is that Italians and French would call garantism. It's a guarantee against arbitrary rule and essentially a limit on arbitrary rule. And then in this context, legalism, as much as it is associated with protection of the given legal order, is illiberal by definition, because the legal order may or may not be liberal, may or may not be democratic, and may or may not be based on universal or any humanistic values and principles. This said about the background, the historical and theoretical background of legalism. Let me go to my conclusions about what is modern legalism, why it is neglected in this discussion about democratic backsliding, and what, as legal scholars especially, we can do about it. Actually, the term legalism is used in the context of the literature I described, but especially and probably exclusively as a term to describe the elite-driven practices of manipulating the law, or using the law for the purposes of either the reproduction of the power or the creation of specific interests within the power groups, or retaining a certain political order. And probably Kim Lane Chapelle would be the champion of this discussion with her famous article on autocratic legalism, discussing the legalistic practices in countries which are famous for the illiberal practices in the last decade or so: Hungary, Turkey, Russia, Poland, etc. As I already said, this work describes legalism especially as an elite-driven, a manipulative tactic. What this work doesn't describe, I don't even assume that it's a failure of this work, because this work is actually intended to describe this elite-driven practices. But what this work doesn't describe is actually the degree to what legalism is embedded within the society in general, not only within the legal, not only within the elites, not only within the decision makers, but also spread quite widely about every layer of the society. Because my point in my work has been that if legalism survives and succeeds as an elite-driven project, it probably has to have some support at the level of the consumers of the laws or the policies which are devised by these decision makers. If Orban is manipulating the law, changing the constitution, having the constitutional judges to resign, etc., all these techniques are what would be called autocratic legalism. if Orban or any other leader is doing this, then it probably has to be approved by someone at some level, has to be consumed and not resisted by someone at some level. The legislature, the judiciary, the bureaucracy, eventually the voters. So my point here has been that it's not only the elite manipulation that characterizes the judicial, the legalistic mindset, but it has to have some very embedded social patterns in order these elite-driven practices would be supported and would survive and resist for so many years already in some countries. And in this context, I refer to legalism, to modern legalism, and it may have a degree, different degrees in some societies and lesser degrees in others. And yet I think that almost all European societies are legalistic in their embedded social core to some substantial extent. And since Max Weber, actually, since the times of Max Weber, the continental legal system would be seen to be more legalistic than the Anglo-Saxon system. And to this proposition, although there is no chance at the moment that it can be measured at any level, probably not even by Max Weber, this proposition sounds quite plausible to me because, as I can observe, actually, the legal culture prevailing in continental Europe is more rule-oriented and more oriented on providing an explicit account of conduct or behavior expected from the consumer of the law. While the Anglo-Saxon law, as you can also judge from the statutory construction of this law, is more oriented on the concepts and outlining principles that can later outline in more explicit details the exact rules of conduct. And what makes legalism to be even worse is especially the communist heritage. And I have seen in my own research to what grotesque and vulgar degree this legalism and as one scholar would call vulgarly positivist culture can take forms in formerly Soviet countries, but also formerly communist countries. And as far as the modern legalism is concerned, a Hungarian scholar, András Jakab, you may know him, he would exactly describe the patterns in modern Hungary among the legal profession, saying that the legalistic patterns actually prevent that are prevalent among Hungarian lawyers makes them blind and defenseless against authoritarian tendencies. And this statement very illustratively echoes that of Judith Schlar, who said that the German lawyers' conservative adaptability actually was a factor contributing to the success of the Nazi regime or its acceptance by the legal profession and the judiciary. Although later I would find out that Jakab actually didn't know the point by Schlar. These were two independent poets very similar to each other. If I try to conclude here, I understand I'm already speaking for almost 30 minutes. The question, the open question I want to pose at the end, probably not an answer, but a question is, given all this analysis about legal culture still mattering for what kind of political system we're arriving at now? Are our legal cultures and we, the lawyers, judges, the legal professionals, immune from illiberal legalism or these tendencies? And to what extent are we? I want to bring this discussion about the significance of legal mindset for these practices. Of course, illiberalism and its rise or fall depend on many, many other political political factors, but the legal mindset might be one of them. And we as lawyers probably need to pay more attention to this. And for my country and for the countries which I have been observing more closely, the post-communist countries, I can say that no, the legal professionals and the legal mindset is not ready to resist whatever illiberal tendencies come or may come. And let me tell you that I don't want to sound pessimistic, but of course, with the fall of communism, the history didn't end as Fukuyama would predict. And now, since the beginning of this year, not only history didn't end, but history started to show its ugly faces again. And we don't know what is coming. We didn't know what is coming in the European neighborhood, but we can also observe that illiberalism has found home and quite resistant home also in the European Union. What is coming and to what extent we are ready to resist these tendencies? Post-communist countries, if any such tendencies resist, our post-communist legal mindset is most likely not really ready. Are the other legal cultures ready to resist these tendencies? This is an open question that I could pose to everyone in this room or to everyone who is listening to us. But one last lesson that I would like to draw from this is that probably we, especially the legal academics and legal teachers, also the political scientists, political philosophers, have a role in this, because it's very important how we teach about the law and how we teach about what the law is or ought to be and not ought to be. And this is how, in my opinion, defines the legal mindset at its immunity from the tendencies that can come and its ability to resist the viruses that are likely also not really left in the past, in the history. I conclude by this, and thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you very much, Armen. Thanks indeed for the fascinating speech. We have 15 minutes for questions and comments. I don't know if in the audience, I mean, someone wants to start with some comments, but otherwise, I'm happy to give to share some thoughts of that. I think that this is a very interesting topic. I don't think that the law as such, I mean, or law as such is immune, I mean, from the risk of being instrumentalized. Actually, I've been working on how even the constitutional law, which is a special kind of law, I mean, has been abused, I mean, by authoritarian and non-authoritarian populists. So at the same time, I mean, the risk, there is a sort of double risk, I mean, here. On the one hand, I mean, one could conceive the law, and this applies also to constitutional law, as the mirror or as the reflection of the relationship existing in terms of political power. So, I mean, one could think that each regime has the right, I mean, to reshape the legal system according to the preferences of the contingent majority. And in this sense, the constitutional law can help in the sense that the constitutional design can offer some countermeasures in order to avoid this risk of instrumentalization. I mean, how? I mean, for instance, by devising, I mean, or by codifying eternity clauses, by introducing attachment clauses, and so on and so forth. Of course, I mean, the constitutional design cannot solve all the issues. Hungary is a good example of that, but In Hungary, they don't have an eternity clause, they don't have a second chamber, so also another counterpower is missing. It is a very centralized system. So I'm not saying that having all these devices will impede the rise of the authoritarian regime more, but I'm just saying that sometimes the constitutional law can help. The other risk is, of course, I mean, that of understanding in a way constitutions as forms of, I would say, ordinary lawmaking processes. I mean, and this is what populists, I mean, sometimes claim. I mean, they attack, I mean, the constitution by questioning the superiority of constitutions. I mean, and by, for instance, I mean, rehabilitating the concept of constituent power, which becomes in their hands a vehicle of legal representment and mobilization. And so we have these two competing risks, of course. I mean, so I have two questions for you. First of all, do you think that the constitutional law is special in this respect, or do you think that we can extend the conclusions already reached your research to follow in general? And second comment, what do you mean by order? Because I was thinking a lot about that when thinking of the title that you have chosen for this lecture. So do you mean a sort of deconstructed order, or a kind of taxes, or do you refer that actually to form a natural order like cosmos? I mean, I'm of course here recalling in a very primitive manner. I mean, the distinction, I mean, made among other things by Hayek. I think that this is a very important point as a certain understanding of the concept of order. I'm thinking of an evolutionary understanding of order can sometimes, I mean, be seen as an antidote and as a limit to the attempt made by authoritarian populists at reshaping the legal system. We can say that certain attempts at reshaping the legal system could be perceived as antithetical to the evolutionary understanding of order, and this would open the way for forms of resistance that perhaps, I don't know, I mean, these are just, I mean, thoughts. I don't know if they make sense, but it was to open the debate. Any other thoughts or comments on that? Perhaps, yeah.
So I have turned on the.
Yeah, but I think that we should, let's try to.
I have turned on the microphone, so this should be better. Okay. Now, thank you, Armen. It's very interesting. I was thinking of a French. Is it okay, or should I? No. A French debate about it's a form of constitutional formalism, which has the effect of sort of trivializing the core of what constitutionalism should be about. What do I mean? You have some discussions about reforms in France. You know, these governmental committees that are in charge of promoting changes throughout the legal order. And basically, they submit a final report of their activities in which they say, well, we need A, B, C. A can be done through constitutional reform. B just needs legislative reform. C allows for either of them. And scholars like Olivier both say, well, this is a way of trivializing what it's a formalistic reading of the Constitution. It's a correct reading of the relations between the different layers of the system of legal sources, but it's ultimately an administrative reading of the Constitution whose ultimate effect is to trivialize what the Constitution stands for, and this may lead to a degradation of the quality of constitutionalism. So it's something quite different from what you were describing with regard to post-Soviet systems in which formalism was a kind of was the effect of a backward-looking legal training, a failed attempt to depoliticize issues. But I think that even Western legal systems may not be immune from some of the risks you were highlighting. Okay.
Okay, since there are no questions at the moment, let me try to answer these very interesting questions. And actually, I would probably see some common aspects in both questions, as far as the question by Giuseppe on what is legal order, or what is the order actually standing for. I think there is it echoes your question, Giacomo, about what actually is constitutional law, or what should it be in the minds of those constitutional scholars in France that you referred to. Actually, from the perspective of Sartori, and I subscribe to this perspective, actually, legal order is simply the status quo about the existing legal regulation. When he makes the distinction between nominal and real constitutions, we can say there are many countries which have a constitution, and these constitutions actually do provide a regulation. They do organize the power. They do provide for the rules of the game, but they are not constitutions in the real meaning of the term. And actually, constitutions do exist in most countries which we would say are either authoritarian or totalitarian, and they are not necessarily only facade constitutions. They do regulate the relationship between power branches. There are power branches, actually. They say who is doing what. They're organizing the polity. They're organizing the society. And in this case, yes, that's the order. If you wish, Sartori also calls it political order or political system. And he distinguishes it from the constitutional order, which necessarily has to be the guarantee against arbitrary power. So the nuclear meaning of the Constitution is, in his analysis, is that of the restraint on the power, the restraint on the political order. And why it echoes the question from Giacomo is that this perspective actually, I think, also gives us a clue of what constitutional law or constitutionalism or constitution might mean in the minds of those French scholars who you recall to. And I might well subscribe to the idea that constitution is not necessarily a set of enacted rules. In some countries, actually, the constitution may not actually even mean anything enacted and yet exist. And Sartori refers to the United Kingdom, the Brits having a constitution since very long ago, even though it is very well accepted that they do not have a written constitution. And he says even they do have even written constitution. It is dispersed among several fundamental acts, and it is a written constitution in his meaning. So these are the underlying values and norms which are guiding and which should be above any political order that is created under them. In that sense, probably the French might refer to a constitution that should be higher to any institutional design or institutional construction or order that can come under it. I don't know if I captured the.
Yeah.
There is another shade of order that can also be discussed, and this order also refers, this is probably more the perspective of Tocqueville and Scuola when they speak about the order in terms of the legal profession, and they refer to actually the conservative, the inherent conservative of the legal profession. And I'm saying inherent because the laws have to have a certain sound degree of certainty in order to be functional and to be efficient. So it is inherent with the legal profession to have this conservative embedded in it. But this is what they refer to, that probably the extreme level of conservatism among the legal protection makes them the victims of the depoliticized exercise of the law, and makes them, because the lawyers are conservative, they don't care from whom, I mean, this is exaggeration, then to explain the pattern, because they are conservative and they are looking for certainty. They don't care from whom the law comes, which sovereign pronounces, and what is the moral standing of the law, whether it requires to kill the prisoner of war, whether it requires to deport a public intellectual because the public intellectual voiced opposition to the attack on Ukraine. So the order in that sense, the order in terms of the integrity of the body of the law and certainty of the body of the law, which makes a functional and efficient flow of the legal system, if you wish. And that's the perspective that de Tocqueville would probably point out more. By the way, it's not, it has a very real life connection to modern legalism. Again, if I went back to Putin, not Putin in this time of the history, but Putin of 20 years ago, when he was still in the making, and many would argue that he would probably like still to take Russia in the democratic direction, but he would like to also have his country, while doing that, to have its own strong and different identity from the Western world. That's probably a little departure from the topic, and yet if Putin would speak about rule of law, he would speak about dictatorship of the law or order. Because if we consider the situation before he came to power, and which was probably the golden age of democracy in Russia, it was also the age of a little bit of anarchy, a little bit of a disillusionment about too much freedom, because people did not know what the freedom was, and then they got freedom, and they got mafia also, they got a lot of a lack of regulation, etc. So for him, order, in the very, very ordinary sense of the term, order, that the law is actually implemented, that the law is not violated, that the mafia does not take over. So the rule of law would be equal to the ideal of order. So the ideal of order in very legalistic minds is also prevailing in this sense. So the lawyers would prefer order to freedom. I don't know if I answered your question as much as you expected.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
The history of constitutional amendments in Russia in the last 10 minutes is quite fascinating. It's pretty much.
They don't hear you.
It's yeah.
That's okay, I could hear.
Just saying that the history of constitutional amendments in Russia over the last 2 decades is quite fascinating, because it's a part about consolidating what's going on, part about juridicizing these ideal constructs about sovereignty, what being Russian is about, and in a way it's an extreme form, I think, of authoritarian legalism. it's not only about, so it's the opposite of chaos and disorder like in the 90s.
Okay, so I don't know if you wanna reply after comments or.
I would love to, and it would take a lot of time. It's one of my favorite topics.
Okay, so,
We have submitted the research project on.
yeah. Perhaps we could involve, I mean, Adam, if
with pleasure,
it would be, if it would be funded. Okay, so I think that we can close this event. I mean, I'm very grateful. Thanks indeed, I mean,
I'm grateful
for offering, I mean, this brilliant speech, and I'm curious to, I mean, read, I mean, paper, and if they're gonna write something.
I am.
That I want to thank, I mean, those who will be in the audience, and see you, I mean, soon. I mean, we organize many seminars and webinars, so I'm sure that the occasions will not be missing. Thanks indeed. Bye-bye.
Thank you.